Every morning, without fail, Paul and his 7-year-old daughter Rosie would appear on the path. Audrey didn't have to wait long before she heard their footsteps. First, Paul's steady stride, then the quick patter of small shoes. She'd be struggling with her wheelchair on the cracked pavement, same as always, and they'd simply arrive. No grand gestures, just a gentle hand steadying the wheel, a child's voice saying, "Hi, Miss Audrey," and a man whose gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The ritual became part of her morning, more reliable than sunrise. She'd find herself glancing up the path, waiting, hoping. But something shifted in those stolen moments when Paul wasn't looking. His eyes held something deeper than kindness. Hers held something she was terrified to name. Then one morning, when she finally gathered the courage to ask him the question that had been burning in her chest, everything would change. For the morning sun filtered through the oak trees lining Riverside Park, casting a mosaic of gold and shadow across the walking path. Audrey wheeled herself along the cracked pavement, her hands moving in practiced motions that had become second nature over 3 years. The left wheel always stuck slightly going over the uneven concrete, the same crack every single day. She'd learned to anticipate it, to brace herself, to push harder on that side. Today would be no different from yesterday. Tomorrow would be no different from today. This was her life now, the same path, the same time, the same 4 walls of an apartment that felt smaller with each passing month. She'd given up the larger dreams somewhere between the hospital discharge and that first lonely winter. The doctors had said she was lucky to be alive. Her mother had said the same thing, though her eyes suggested otherwise. Lucky. The word tasted like ash. Lucky didn't mean she could feel her legs. Lucky didn't mean strangers looked at her with anything other than pity. Lucky didn't mean she'd spend the rest of her life dependent on someone else's kindness, or worse, their obligation. But then came the Thursday, when Paul and Rosie first appeared. She heard them before she saw them. The steady rhythm of a man's stride followed by the quick pattering of small shoes trying to keep pace. Audrey didn't look up. She'd learned not to make eye contact when people approached. It was easier that way. Less chance for someone to feel burdened by her presence. Less chance for her to see the flicker of discomfort in their expression. But something made her pause. The footsteps slowed. They didn't pass by. "Hey there," a voice said, warm, genuine, without the artificial brightness people often used when speaking to her. "Looks like you hit the rough patch." Audrey glanced up and saw a man in his early 40s, maybe 5 years into single fatherhood, based on the particular kind of tired etched around his eyes. Not the exhausted tired of someone who didn't care, the tired of someone giving his entire self to someone he loved. Beside him stood a girl with his same dark hair, regarding Audrey with the unburdened curiosity only children possess. "I'm okay," Audrey said automatically, the standard deflection. "I know," the man replied, and he said it in a way that suggested he actually meant it, that he wasn't offering pity, but simply an observation. "You've got this. But if you want a hand with that sticky wheel, I'm Paul. This is Rosie." He didn't wait for permission. He simply steadied the wheelchair with one hand, guided her through the worst of the cracked section onto the smoother concrete beyond. His touch was practical, respectful, the kind of help that felt like assistance rather than charity. When he released the chair, his hand lingered for just a moment, and Audrey felt something shift in her chest. A flutter, a warning, a spark of something she'd convinced herself was dead. "Thank you," she said quietly, still not quite meeting his eyes. "Same time tomorrow?" Rosie asked hopefully, as if the girl already sensed what Audrey needed before she knew it herself. Audrey wanted to say no. She wanted to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment that came when people realized how much of a burden true friendship required. Instead, she heard herself say, "Maybe." That single word was a lie and a prayer, all at once. They returned the next morning, and the morning after, and every morning for 3 weeks straight, until Audrey found herself waking at 6:30, exactly 1 hour before her usual time, seized by an anxious hope she hadn't felt in years. She'd tell herself she was just taking a different route, tell herself that maybe she needed to be out of the apartment more, lie to herself about anything except the one truth she couldn't ignore. She was waiting for them. Paul would help navigate the difficult stretch of pavement. Rosie would chatter about things only a 7-year-old found fascinating. A butterfly with a broken wing, clouds that looked like dinosaurs, whether penguins could fly if they really tried. And Paul would smile at his daughter, indulgent and patient, then glance at Audrey with something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was during the 4th week that the first crack formed. They'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm by then, comfortable enough that Paul had started lingering longer, sitting on a nearby bench while Rosie explored the path for interesting rocks and fallen acorns. They talked about inconsequential things, the weather, the park, the way the light changed with the seasons, safe topics, surface-level topics. Audrey had become an expert at surface level. It was the only way to maintain the armor. But that morning, after Rosie had wandered down the path chasing a butterfly, Paul turned to Audrey with a seriousness that dissolved her carefully constructed walls. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I've noticed you work hard with that chair. Every single morning that left wheel gives you trouble, and you never complain." Audrey's shoulders tensed. "It's just a wheel." "It's not just anything," Paul continued gently. "I was thinking, there's a physical therapist not far from here. I have a friend who swears by her, and I was wondering if you'd ever considered—" He trailed off, reading the shift in her expression. But the damage was already done. Her breath came sharp, anger flaring unexpectedly. "Considered what, Paul? Physical therapy? Therapy doesn't give you back what the accident took. I've already tried. I've already spent hours in painful sessions with therapists who looked at my legs like they could fix what God broke." "That's not what I meant," Paul said carefully. But Audrey was already pulling away, already building the walls back up. "No." Her hands gripped the wheels of her chair. "Then what did you mean? That I'm not trying hard enough? That if I just pushed myself a little more, suffered a little more, maybe I could walk again? Maybe I could stop being the sad disabled woman in the park that people feel sorry for?" Paul's jaw tightened, and she saw it then, the moment she'd hurt him. Not because she'd been cruel, but because her words forced him to confront something he'd been trying to ignore. There was something in his gaze that went deeper than kindness. He wanted her to see herself the way he was beginning to see her, and she wasn't ready for that. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "None of this is fair," Audrey replied, turning her wheelchair away from him. "I appreciate what you do, Paul, I really do. But you don't have to fix me. You don't have to fix anything. Just, please, don't try." He didn't come back for 3 days. The absence was louder than any presence could have been. Audrey found herself on that park path at 6:30 in the morning anyway, telling herself it was coincidence that she'd been going to the park anyway, that she wasn't waiting. But the truth sat in her chest like a stone. She was waiting. She was always waiting now. The morning felt wrong without the sound of their footsteps, without Rosie's cheerful greeting, without the complicated tangle of emotions that Paul's presence stirred in her. By day 4, she couldn't take it anymore. She'd spent 3 years avoiding risk, avoiding hope, avoiding anything that could hurt her again. And here she was, drowning in hurt anyway, because she'd let someone in just enough to matter. She found the number Paul had written down for her, the one with the physical therapist's contact information he'd left on a scrap of paper the second week they'd met. Her hands trembled as she made the call. Not because she believed in recovery, not because she'd suddenly developed faith in miracles, but because she needed Paul to understand that his faith in her meant something, that his refusal to see her as broken mattered more than she could adequately explain. The first session was brutal. Dr. Marcus, the physical therapist, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and no tolerance for self-pity. She'd examined Audrey's legs with clinical precision, asked detailed questions about the extent of the spinal injury, and then laid out the facts with brutal honesty. "You have some nerve function that wasn't completely destroyed. That means there's potential for improvement. But I want to be clear, recovery is possible, but it's not guaranteed, and it will hurt." Audrey had already endured enough pain. Physical pain was nothing compared to the ache of being seen as something broken, but she'd nodded anyway, already imagining Paul's face when he heard she'd taken the first step, already imagining him knowing that his belief in her had transformed into action. The weeks that followed became a montage of small, agonizing victories. In the first week, she regained sensation in her left foot. Didn't sound like much, a tingling, almost electric feeling, but it was the first time in 3 years that she'd felt anything below the damage point. She'd cried in that clinic, with Dr. Marcus pretending not to notice while casually organizing treatment materials. By week 3, her right leg began to respond to electrical stimulation therapy. Tiny movements, involuntary at first, then gradually something she could almost control. The pain was extraordinary, a burning sensation, as nerve pathways that had gone dormant began firing again. She'd grip the arms of the therapy chair and count down the minutes, but she always came back. And she did it without Paul and Rosie there to witness it. That was the cruelest part. She was transforming herself for them, pushing through impossible pain, and they had no idea it was happening. She'd see other people at the clinic with families in the waiting room, spouses bringing flowers, children drawing pictures of mommy getting stronger, and she'd be alone, as she'd been alone for so long. Except now her solitude felt like a choice she'd made. It was during her 5th session that she finally broke. She'd been on the parallel bars, using her hands to support most of her weight while trying to shift her legs. The pain was overwhelming, her muscles screaming, her mind rebelling. And suddenly Paul's voice came back to her. "You never complain." The implication crushing. Maybe she never complained because no one was listening. Maybe her strength meant nothing because there was no one to witness it. "Stop," she told Dr. Marcus, and she meant it in a way that suggested she might never start again. "We have another 15 minutes, Dr. Marcus said matter-of-factly. "I can't," Audrey's voice cracked. "What's the point? Who am I even doing this for? To walk alone? To prove something to someone who doesn't even care enough to show up?" Dr. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then set down her clipboard. "You're doing this for yourself, aren't you?" But that wasn't true. Audrey realized with painful clarity that she was doing this for Paul, for Rosie, for a fantasy version of their future where her recovery meant she was worthy of their love. And in doing it for them, she'd trapped herself in an expectation that had no room for failure. Back in her apartment that evening, Audrey sat in her wheelchair by the window and made a decision. She would stop the physical therapy. She would stop hoping. She would rebuild the walls Paul and Rosie had so carelessly demolished. It was safer that way. But then, 2 mornings later, she heard footsteps on the path below her apartment window. Not just any footsteps. Paul's steady stride and Rosie's quick patter, and the little girl was calling out, "Audrey, are you here?" Despite everything, despite the armor she'd carefully reconstructed, Audrey found her heart responding before her mind could catch up. And when Rosie appeared at her apartment door, how they'd gotten her address she had no idea and didn't ask. The girl's face was creased with genuine worry. "Why haven't you been at the park?" Rosie asked without preamble. "And why is Dad so sad all the time now?" The question was so perfectly, painfully honest that Audrey felt something break inside her. Behind Rosie, Paul stood in the hallway, and his expression confirmed everything. He wasn't sad because she'd rejected him. He was sad because he cared, not in the pitying way she'd feared, not in the obligatory way she'd convinced herself, but in the way that made her rejection of his help feel like a rejection of him. "I started physical therapy," Audrey found herself saying, her voice small. "Because of you. Because you believed I was capable of more than I believed in myself. And it's terrifying, because what if I'm not? What if I fail? What if all that pain is for nothing?" Paul knelt beside her wheelchair, and for the first time, he didn't offer her space or pretend not to notice her fear. He simply said, "Then you'll fail, and you'll still be Audrey. You'll still be the woman." He stopped himself, glanced at Rosie, then continued. "The woman we care about. The wheelchair is temporary. The injury is real. But neither of those things define your worth." Rosie, understanding that she'd been somehow crucial to this moment, even if she didn't fully comprehend the adult emotions at play, reached over and took Audrey's hand. "Will you come back to the park?" Audrey looked at the small girl, then at Paul, and felt something shift back into place. Not hope, she was still too afraid for that, but something like willingness, like the first tentative movement toward trust. "Yes," she said. "I'll come back." The next 6 weeks became the most difficult and most important of Audrey's life. With Paul and Rosie's knowledge of her therapy, the stakes somehow became more real. She couldn't hide her pain. She couldn't pretend the sessions were easier than they were. And in sharing that struggle, something unexpected happened. She let them in completely. Paul would meet her at the clinic twice a week after his shifts. Sometimes he'd sit in the waiting room and work on his laptop. Other times, when Dr. Marcus allowed it, he'd stand beside the parallel bars, offering encouragement that never once tipped into pressure. And Rosie, who had a natural gift for making difficult moments bearable, would narrate the process like a sports commentator. "Okay, here comes the big push. She's going for it, and she's got it. She's got it." The progress was real, but agonizingly slow. By week 8, Audrey could stand for 45 seconds with minimal support. Her legs trembled with the effort, and the pain never fully subsided, but she could stand. For the first time in 3 years, she could stand. But progress in physical therapy wasn't matched by progress in the emotional landscape between Paul and Audrey. The air between them had become charged with something unspoken. His gaze lingered too long. Her breath caught when he was near. They existed in a state of almost touching hands, almost saying the words that hung unspoken between them, almost acknowledging the growing reality that his feelings had never been about charity or obligation. Rosie, with a child's uncanny perception, finally forced the issue. It happened after a particularly grueling therapy session. Audrey had attempted to stand for a full 2 minutes and had managed 1 minute and 30 seconds before her legs gave out. The failure sent her spiraling, and she'd sat in the clinic's bathroom for 20 minutes trying to collect herself. When she emerged, Rosie was waiting, and Paul was in the hallway on his phone with his boss, clearly having called in late to stay with Audrey. "Audrey, can I ask you something?" Rosie said as they left the clinic, Paul managing the wheelchair while the girl walked beside them. "Of course," Audrey said, steeling herself for a question she wasn't sure she could answer. "Do you love my dad?" The question landed like a stone into still water. Paul's steps stuttered. He turned to his daughter, ready to apologize, but Audrey's voice cut through the awkward silence. "It's more complicated than that," Audrey said carefully, which was the adult way of saying yes in a situation that terrified you. "Why?" Rosie asked with the logic of a 7-year-old. "If you love someone, you should just tell them. That's what Dad taught me." Paul looked like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. "Rosie, that's not a conversation for—" "I love her too," Rosie continued, undeterred by her father's discomfort. "You're always looking at her when you think she's not watching, and you get sad when she's sad. So why don't you just say it?" The honesty of children was like a scalpel, cutting through all the protective layers both adults had constructed. La peur. That evening, after Paul dropped Audrey at her apartment and returned with Rosie to their small house across town, Audrey couldn't sleep. She lay awake analyzing every interaction, every moment when Paul's hand had touched her shoulder, every time his eyes had met hers with something that looked dangerously like love. By the next morning, she'd convinced herself it was all projection. He pitied her. He felt responsible for her. He was attracted to her because he was rescuing her, and rescue had a way of feeling like romance until the rescued person was no longer broken and didn't need him anymore. The thought made her ill. When Paul and Rosie appeared at the park path, Audrey was ready. She'd fortified herself. She'd rebuilt the walls. And when Paul settled onto the bench beside her wheelchair, she didn't look at him. "We need to talk about boundaries," she said, her voice clipped. "Professional, you've been incredible. Both of you have. But I'm starting to understand what's happening, and I need to be honest about it." Paul's entire body went still. "Okay. You care about me," Audrey continued, finally turning to face him. "And I think part of that is genuine. But another part of it is the satisfaction of helping, the role of the rescuer. And I can't be the woman you save, Paul. I won't. Because eventually, I'll either get better and you'll lose the reason to stay, or I won't get better and you'll resent me for not being the inspiring story you wanted." "That's not fair," Paul said, and there was pain in his voice that suggested she'd struck at something true. "You think I need you to be broken for me to care about you? I think people like you, good people, kind people, often confuse help with love, and I won't trap myself in that confusion." She expected him to argue, to defend himself, to insist that he cared. Instead, he stood up, and the calmness of his movement was somehow worse than anger would have been. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right. I've been dishonest with myself. I've been acting like what I feel is just kindness. It's easier than admitting that I'm terrified of what I feel for you, that I have no idea if you could ever feel the same way. And that scares me more than anything I've experienced since losing Rosie's mother." He paused, and Audrey's breath caught. "But I'm done being dishonest," he continued. "I'm done pretending. I love you, Audrey. Not as someone broken that I'm trying to fix, as someone with extraordinary strength who faced 3 years of isolation and didn't lose her kindness. As someone who laughs at Rosie's terrible jokes and reads her bedtime stories even when she doesn't ask. As someone I want in my life, not because you need me, but because I need you." The confession hung between them like a physical thing. "If you don't feel the same way, I'll respect that," Paul said. "I'll stay away if that's what you need. But I won't pretend anymore. Not to myself, not to you." Audrey's hands trembled. She wanted to tell him he was wrong. She wanted to protect herself. She wanted to run. But what she did instead was look at him, really look at him, and see that he meant every word. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "I know," Paul replied, and the gentleness in his voice undid her. "Not of you," she clarified, "of myself, of what happens if I let myself believe this is real and then I fail at recovery. What if I'm never more than this?" She gestured to her wheelchair. "Then you'll be the most remarkable woman I know," Paul said simply. "But something tells me you're going to surprise yourself." 3 days later, during what was supposed to be a routine therapy session, something shifted. Audrey was on the parallel bars again, attempting her longest stand yet. Paul was there, as he'd been every session since their conversation. Rosie was in the waiting room drawing pictures. Audrey was at 2 minutes. Her legs were burning. Her arms shook with the effort of supporting herself. But then she heard Paul's voice, low and steady. "You're stronger than you think, Audrey. I've always known it. It's time you knew it too." Something cracked open in her chest. She pushed through the pain. She pushed because Paul believed in her, but more importantly, she pushed because somewhere in the process, she'd started to believe in herself. At 2 minutes and 45 seconds, her right leg began to respond, not involuntarily, but genuinely, intentionally responding to her command. She took a breath, another, and then, with Paul's hand ready to catch her and her own iron will holding her upright, Audrey rose from the parallel bars and took one small step. Just one. But it was hers. The breakthrough sparked something that couldn't be contained. Over the following weeks, Audrey's recovery accelerated. She moved from the parallel bars to a walker, then to a cane. She could stand for minutes at a time. She could walk, not without pain, not without effort, but she could move through the world under her own power again. More importantly, she could move toward things, toward Paul, toward Rosie, toward the idea that happiness might not be a luxury reserved for people with functioning legs. The morning after her first steps, Paul found her on a bench outside the clinic, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. "That looks like sadness," Paul observed, settling beside her. "I was expecting celebration." "I'm happy," Audrey said. "I'm just processing. 3 weeks ago I was convinced my life was over, and now you're starting," Paul said softly. "Not back where you were, but forward, toward somewhere new." "What if I can't handle it?" Audrey asked. What if recovery means facing all the things I've avoided for 3 years? Paul took her hand. You're not going to be alone unless you choose to be. Unless you keep pushing us away because fear is more familiar than hope. How are you so sure? I'm not, Paul admitted. I'm terrified every day that I'm going to mess this up, but I've learned that certainty is a lie. All we have is this moment, and in this moment, I'm choosing to believe in you, in us. That conversation became a turning point, not because Audrey's doubts vanished, but because she started voicing them instead of letting them calcify. And each time she voiced them, Paul's response was the same. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Rosie, meanwhile, was undergoing her own journey. There had been a stretch when the girl had become unusually quiet around her. Audrey eventually realized, with Paul's embarrassed explanation, that Rosie was worried Audrey would replace her mother. Your mom will always be Rosie's mom, Audrey had told the girl. I'm not trying to replace her, but I would really like to be part of your life, if you want me to be. Rosie had considered this with the seriousness only children could muster. Will you be my stepmom? Let's take it one day at a time, Audrey had replied, smiling. But yes, I want to try. You love my dad, Rosie observed. I do, Audrey admitted. But you want to try the steps? Yes, Audrey said. I want to try all the steps. By week 12 of therapy, Audrey was walking for short distances with a cane. She'd moved from thinking of herself as a patient to someone in recovery. The distinction was important. Patients were passive. People in recovery were actively choosing their future, and her future, she was increasingly certain, included Paul and Rosie. The moment that solidified everything came on an ordinary Tuesday. Paul had brought Audrey to the park path, the place where they'd met, where her life had cracked open to the possibility of something more. She was walking slowly, her hand in his, Rosie skipping beside them with the unconcerned joy of a child who knew everything was going to be okay. They paused at the worst section of cracked pavement, the stretch that had once seemed insurmountable. Audrey looked down at the broken concrete, then back at the distance she'd walked. Weeks of pain, months of effort, years of believing the worst about herself. I used to think this cracked pavement was my whole world, she said. And then you and Rosie showed up, and suddenly I could see the path extending beyond it. Paul squeezed her hand. You did that. We just believed in you. No, Audrey said. You showed up every morning even when I pushed you away. You loved me before I believed I was lovable. Because you are, Paul said simply. You always were. 3 months after her first step, Audrey stood at the entrance to Riverside Park at 6:30 in the morning. She no longer needed the chair for daily movement, though she kept it for long distances. Today, she didn't bring it. Paul and Rosie were waiting at their usual spot. Audrey approached them under her own power, moving with a cane, but moving. When she reached Paul, they stood together as equals, his hand finding hers not out of necessity, but out of choice. Ready? He asked. For what? Audrey replied, though she had a feeling she knew. Paul knelt on the cracked pavement and pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. I know we said one day at a time, he began, but I've been one day at a timing for 3 months now, and every single day I'm certain about what I want. I want to wake up next to you. I want Rosie to have you as part of her daily life. I want a future that includes you being a permanent part of our story. Rosie was jumping up and down. Is this the step where she says yes? Audrey laughed, genuine and uninhibited. Yes, she said. The answer is yes. Paul slipped the ring on her finger, and it caught the morning light. As they walked back along the path together, Paul on one side, Rosie holding Audrey's other hand, other people in the park began to notice. A family, not perfect, not without scars, but genuine and growing and full of possibility. They reached the spot where Paul had first steadied her wheelchair. Audrey paused, looking down at the cracked pavement. It was still broken. It would always be broken, but it was no longer her entire world. Thank you, she said to Paul, for showing her that broken things could become beautiful, that the cracks in her life could let light in. "You did that," Paul replied. "I just stood beside you while you did it." As they continued down the path, the park filled with early morning light, and in that golden moment, with her hand in Paul's and Rosie's small voice filling the morning with joy, Audrey finally understood. Recovery wasn't about returning to the person you used to be. It was about discovering who you could become, and the love that made it possible wasn't about fixing someone broken. It was about believing in the unbroken strength that exists within everyone. 3 years of isolation had taught her to be alone. 3 months with Paul and Rosie had taught her something far more valuable: how to belong. 6 months later, Audrey stood in the kitchen of Paul's house, soon to be their house, with a ring on her finger and a wedding date on the calendar. Through the window, she could see Paul and Rosie in the backyard planting a garden. That was the revolution that lived quietly in her everyday life now. Could instead of couldn't, doing instead of managing around. The phone buzzed, a message from Rosie. "Audrey's garden will be the most beautiful because she picked the flowers. Love you, Audrey." The love felt earned now, not because she'd walked or recovered, but because she'd chosen to stay, chosen to believe, chosen to become the person capable of receiving love. By the time Paul and Rosie came in from the garden, breakfast was ready. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Audrey felt the weight and rightness of routine, of family. "Tomorrow we go back to the park path?" Rosie asked hopefully. "We always do," Paul said, squeezing Audrey's hand. "Every morning we can." Audrey smiled, remembering that first morning when she'd been convinced her life was over. How wrong she'd been, how gloriously, impossibly wrong. Every morning, Paul and his daughter appeared on the path. And now, every morning, Audrey was there to meet them, not waiting for them to arrive, but walking toward them, whole and strong and entirely irreversibly loved.